first question, does this 201 decision apply only to solar components made in China or to all equipment manufactured outside of the U.S.?
I didn't touch anything.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's pretty clear from the Trump administration that the C201 applies to all countries. There have been no exclusions to country, no exclusions to technology, short of thin film, which was not in scope in the first place. And I will say to the crowd, because this is probably going to be the next question, the original AD/CVD tariffs on China production are still in place. The C201 lays on top of that. So essentially, China production has a double tariff, which puts you into the 60 to 80% range. Therefore, we will not be seeing any product from that production capacity.
Great, thank you, Vince. So one of the other questions we had is for you, Vincent, is Canadian Solar a majority Chinese-owned company? If not, who owns Canadian Solar?
Yeah, great question. So we are actually a Canadian-based company. So we were incorporated and founded, and we've been in Canada since 2001, actually prior to us even being founded. We are listed on the NASDAQ. We have multiple shareholders because we are publicly held. Do we have a lot of Asian manufacturing facilities? Absolutely. It's the only way to do business to stay competitive. I see the next question there is how are the NAFTA countries not excluded? Fantastic question. I don't have an answer to that one. We're a little disappointed that the Trump administration has chosen not to follow NAFTA guidelines in this particular trade case.
And I think that points to the bigger question of just NAFTA and the Trump administration's perspective on NAFTA as it's wrestling whether it wants to abide by NAFTA regulations. Gary or Pavel, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that on the econ side.
Yeah, what I would add is, and this is my understanding of what's obviously a very complex kind of regulatory dynamic, but I actually read that there are exclusions, national level exclusions from the tariff for a set of developing countries, most of which have no solar manufacturing of any kind. So it's kind of academic to exclude them, most of Africa, for example. But there are, again, based on my read of the White House order, there are some countries like India whose product comes into the U.S. in very small quantities. And because of that small quantity, 3% threshold, they're actually exempt from the tariff. Again, it's not very meaningful because the fact of the matter is 70% of the solar imports come from China and Taiwan. But at least in theory, there are some countries whose modules could come in tariff-free, again, as long as they fall under that 3% threshold.
Great, thank you. One of the other questions we have is, does Soligent still plan on selling SolarWorld modules? And the answer is yes, we are still very much a strong partner with SolarWorld. And for those listening who don't know, SolarWorld is manufactured both in Germany, which would see tariffs in addition to the U.S., which would not see tariffs. One of the other questions we have is, where does the money collected via the tariff go? Pavel or Gary, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, it goes into the treasury is the short answer. And, it's interesting that 30%, as we all know, of fully installed solar system costs are offset by the investment tax credit. So if the price of those systems gets increased as a result of the tariff, the Treasury will actually have to pay out a little bit more in the form of that tax credit, right, to offset the 30% of the extra 10 cents or whatever the extra cost ends up being. So it's a bit of a, take with one hand, give to the other. In theory, the tariff revenue will exceed what the Treasury has to pay out in that extra ITC. The only point I'm making is this is not a get-rich-quick scheme from the standpoint of the government. Any amounts they collect in this are simply not going to be needle moving, to state the obvious in the context of $4 trillion federal budget.
Good, thank you. And one of the other questions we have for Vincent is, does Canadian Solar have any thoughts on manufacturing in the U.S. in the near term to provide tariff-free modules?
Great question. I would say that the jury on that is still out. I think Jonathan previously did a good job of kind of outlining the risks and challenges to investing in the U.S. for U.S.-based manufacturing facilities. At first blush, I would say that the time horizon and the trade down of the tariff rate is not in favor of supporting U.S.-based manufacturing facilities. At this point in time, I would say we're going to leave ourselves flexible on that particular subject, just because we still don't have any guidelines as to the administration of the 2.5 gigawatts of tariff-free cells. So it does leave the door open for a potential, but on the top line, the economics don't necessarily play out, and I would not expect to see a lot of announcements of companies setting up shop here.
Great, thank you. And one of the another question
as well,
we have,
by the way.
Great.
Just so you know.
Another question we have is, since Chinese and other manufacturers already raised their prices by 20% or more over the last 6 months, or in that range, what is the real net result of the tariff? Will it be 10% or less, or are we going to see the full price of the tariff in module prices?
I guess I'll try and field that one. It felt like the market had moved ahead of the announcement, as the ITC had kind of given some guidance as to what the expectations were for tariffs. That being said, I think we've been able to hold our pricing flat to Q4 for our distribution partner, Soligent. I don't expect significant changes from that, just driven by the tariffs. However, the supply-demand curve still is in play and can swing product costs and pricing to our end customers up and down accordingly.
Thanks, Vincent. Another question is, has anyone analyzed how ratepayers will be impacted by utility-owned and utility-constructed PV arrays? For our economists on the phone.
Yeah, I mean,
Any thoughts?
Yeah, let me try to address that. So the national average retail electricity price is around 13 cents a kilowatt hour. And that number, interestingly enough, has increased every year for at least the last decade. Now, how can that be when we have cheap natural gas, cheap coal, wind getting cheaper, solar getting cheaper, everything's supposedly getting cheaper, and yet retail electricity prices keep going up? So the answer is wholesale electricity prices are coming down. In fact, they're so low that we're seeing all these coal-fired power plants shutting down. But at the retail level, what consumers pay on their monthly utility bill, prices have gone up every year for the last 10 years. Wholesale prices are a component of what retail ratepayers pay, but they're not all of it. In fact, they're not even half of it. Most of what you pay in your electric bill represents transmission, distribution, and the utility's profit margin. And note transmission distribution costs are going up because of things like, smart meters getting installed, which have to be passed through the rate base, investments in grid modernization, hardening the grid against cyber attack, et cetera, et cetera. So cheap wholesale electricity is not going away, notwithstanding what happens with a solar tariff. But retail power prices have been going up repeatedly. In fact, this is one reason why 1 million people in this country have a solar rooftop system already. When it was 8 cents a kilowatt hour, the economics were obviously not as good as they are at 13 cents a kilowatt hour. And that 13 cents is going to go up every year, not dramatically, but maybe a couple of percentage points at least. So, tariffs are not a major variable in that, but really it's just the way the utility sector works, right? Prices go up no matter what.
Great. Thank you, Pavel. So one of the other questions was if the company that owns the manufacturing plant is located outside the U.S., but the manufacturing is located in the U.S., does the tariff apply? Yes. Anything that is manufactured in the U.S., sorry, the tariff does not apply to anything that is manufactured in the U.S., so that would be in the clear. So I'm going to hand it over to John Duchin. Thank you all for joining us today. I know John has some closing remarks. We've got lots of great questions pouring in, and we'll do another one of these soon to talk about industry events and pricing. John, are you there?
Sure, as long as you guys can hear me. I feel like our fiber got nailed. Well, first, I just wanted to make a few closing remarks that I was hoping to share earlier, which was just at a high level. If you are in solar and you are running a company, the one thing that I see that successful companies do is they take a step back for a little bit of time. They look at their overhead. They make sure that they're doing cash flows, which is not a core and a common practice, and they make sure those cash flows actually are aligned and right. Because with these ups and downs, you have to be careful in our industry. We're a growing industry. The world is growing in solar. It's going to be amazing. But I want to make sure that everybody who is in solar and on this phone call does it with us, and we do it with them. And so if you're running a solar company or you have that power to help influence the solar company, think about what it means to have, fixed prices on contracts as you go into the next, quarter, the things that you've sold already and your price is increasing, what that means to your bottom line. The other thing is every solar company I've seen, almost every, I won't say every, but 30% of the overhead can actually be reduced when you really think about that business, when you take a step back and you think about it in that sense. So if you're in a shrinking or growing state, just pay attention to those things and make sure that you're really looking at that pulse, because as soon as that EBITDA or that net income turns negative, those credit lines go away, and then you don't have the working capital to drive your business really, really successfully. And we want to see you guys do that. So that's just the big thing for me. It's the one thing that every time I interact and I sit down with the CEO of a solar company, I really try to make sure that we think about it together. And then finally, what I really appreciate is the thoughts, the depth that you guys had, our panelists had in this conversation and the questions. Pavel, Gary, Vince, I mean, you guys just have an amazing outlook and amazing depth, and each one of you knowing detail all of these pieces. And I think that's just something to applaud. And your partnership over the years has been amazing. And so I just wanted to thank you all for being there, for taking time to do this out of your busy schedule, and for helping everybody on this phone call really understand in depth the solar markets and what this means for them. So thanks to everybody. All right, I think we can end it there.
Thank you all.